Good evening, everyone. Welcome to today's webinar. My name is Sophia. I organize Spectrum events for you. So bringing everyone together through learning Spectrum. For those of you who are new to Spectrum, we are located at Duo Tower. So aside from providing event spaces, we offer curated workspaces for the community experience. We bring members together and provide the connections for your business, to expand your business. So today's webinar, in partnership with Mana Partners, is on investing in esports, translating market growth into business opportunities. Super excited to have great panelists today. First up, I have Jasper Ma, Director of Esports Asia Pacific Sport 5. He is a games and esports industry professional who has been in the industry for 14 years, working in various parts of Asia. In Sport 5, the world's leading agency in esports commercialization, Jasper will share with his views in relation to what he does, developing the commercial strategy and advising brands on their involvement in esports. Next up, joining us all the way from the US is John Yao, CEO of Team Secret. He leads the brand development of Team Secret, a globally renowned esports club that ranks top 10 in total all-time tournament earnings. John has been featured in publications such as Forbes magazine and the Esports Observer. He will be sharing his perspectives on what he does with more than 12 years experience on strategy and growth initiatives in esports. So next up, I have Sean Tang, CEO of Talon Esports, an investment and research professional who has worked at major banks and brokerage firms. He was a computer programmer with passion in technology. So based in the headquarters in Hong Kong, Sean will provide his perspectives in what Talon Esports does, focusing on producing exciting and informative content to promote esports throughout the region. Last but never the least, I have Jamie Lewin, founder and chief strategy officer of Mana Partners. He was the head of innovation for Mindshare Asia Pacific and has a highly awarded history of work with brands at WPP. He was Riot Games' first head of brand partnerships in Southeast Asia and Greater China. Who best to moderate today's panel discussion with his understanding of the inner workings of esports, agencies, brands, sponsorships, developers, and publishers in the region. Before I hand this over to Jamie, audience, please post your questions onto the platform here. If you have questions for specific panelists, please mention their names in your question. So without further ado, over to you, Jamie. Thank you.
Thanks for joining, everybody. I think the first thing I'd like to do is just set the scene a little bit. So gaming represents a truly seismic shift in social entertainment behaviors. It is a convergence of these two things. So friendships and rivalries are formed in-game. Those consumers are leveling up not just by playing the games themselves, but by watching as well, through esports or watching their favorite streamers on mainstay social platforms and media platforms. So it's fair to say there's a whole ecosystem which exists around games. There's a whole media kind of experience ecosystem. The gamers themselves aren't fenced in that kind of the definition of a young male demographic anymore. That has really been challenged. Half the world's population at this point are playing games. We've got an equal number of men and women, and the average age is actually 33 years old. So, you know, people who have kids, and we're generational gamers at this point. There's about 1.5 billion, or 55% of the world's gaming population, is actually in the APAC region, and we're still the fastest growing. Drilling down a little bit into Southeast Asia, the thing that it sets it apart from other regions in the world is that about 75% of the total revenue is actually in mobile. And most revenue comes from freemium games, where the game itself is free, but the in-game items aren't. So this creates really fertile and kind of welcome territory for brands to participate in the gaming economy. Also, when we look at Southeast Asia, depending on the market, up to a third of all those who play also consume esports. This is really not normal compared to the globe. We really over-index in this area. and versus some Western markets is actually 5 times the participation in esport and the consumption of esport content versus just playing the game itself. So there's certainly a really interesting space for us to all be playing in. So on that topic, today we have some incredible panelists. We've got Sean and John being CEOs of globally renowned teams. We've got Jasper, who has been instrumental in his industry roles, supporting government initiatives, but also consulting to brands and advertisers. So guys, if you could please introduce yourselves in order. Jasper, let's lead with you.
Okay, so hello everyone. This is Jasper. I work for Sports5 as the Director of Esports for the APAC region. I was previously, maybe I'll say 13 or 14 years ago, competing in the same place as a professional gamer. But back then there was no salaries involved. In the last 14 years, I have been involved with multiple esports opportunities and companies. And within the last 8 years, I was previously at a company called ESL, which is one of the world's largest esports organizing companies. And now I serve the Singapore government as their industry advisor, as well as being the commercial director in charge of esports at Sports5. So my role actually involves on a daily basis, looking at how to help rights holders, in this case, companies who have a IP in esports, starting from leagues, teams, to even influencers at the individual level, to get themselves ready to be commercialized, so that they can be supported with sponsorships and campaigns that helps grow their esports properties bigger. I also work on this side of advising brands on how they can get into the esports space, especially when you're looking at a very, very new market to them in this time and space right now. Yeah.
Great. Sean, what about you?
Hey guys, how you doing? My name's Sean, the CEO and co-founder of Talon. My background is kind of a little bit mixed. I've always been a big gamer from a very young age, but from a professional working background, it's kind of been for tech development, banking background. Also a big competitor, and I love professional sports and have played, soccer semi-professionally and coached semi-professionally in Australia. And so that's kind of how sort of this whole esports thing happened, combining those two passions of mine, gaming and the competitive side of things. Talon is an esports platform that sits across APAC. We sort of have 3 key business lines. The first being esports teams. And so we own and operate about 7 professional teams in 5 different markets across the APAC region. We also have a creative studio. The creative studio is pretty much focused on the creation of content on behalf of our organization, but also working with external parties, whether it be events, campaigns, et cetera, across the region. And lastly, we have an academy for Overwatch and League of Legends teams, where we take a lot of young players and pass them through our performance frameworks and basically try and make them superstars within the respective games that we're operating.
Awesome. And John?
Hey everyone, my name is John. I'm the CEO of Team Secret. I also have a very mixed background. Spent about 10, 12 years of my career in strategy consulting. I was a director at Pricewaterhouse before I switched over to esports. I switched over because I have a huge affinity for gaming. Former gamer myself, I used to watch a lot of esports, and then I saw a tremendous opportunity in the market in an industry to apply some of my skills from traditional industries. And now here we are. Team Secret is a global esports brand. We focus on 2 primary markets, which is Europe and Southeast Asia. And we have 6 teams at any given point, between 6 and 8 teams. And we have over 20 countries represented across our staff and our players. We focus on essentially trying to build contenders and winning teams to try to go after the championship in every single game that we play in. And that's kind of our identity.
So let's get into some of the questions, because we've got an interesting space to get into. So actually, John, while we've still got you on, would you like to touch on the impact that COVID has had? It's an obvious space to start, but I think a lot of the audience will be assuming that because these are esports, that it hasn't been impacted like traditional sports. So if you could just touch on that a little bit, that'd be great.
Yeah, sure. I think COVID has had a huge impact on every single industry. It's touched basically everything that we have in our daily lives. And so it has also impacted esports, but perhaps in a very different way than other industries may have seen the impact of COVID. And so what I mean is, we are sort of blessed in esports in that we are digital natives, right? Our transition from in-person events and tournaments and those types of things go very naturally online, right? We can immediately pick up and go online. And so the impact initially was that a lot of tournaments and events were canceled or pushed back, right? Which is expected. And you can't really replace the magic of an in-person tournament, right? The roaring crowds, right? The energy, the electricity. But we had the luxury of going online and maintain and even grow our viewership just simply because there's no other forms of competition when it comes to entertainment for a little while. It's because so many sporting events were canceled. So we had such tremendous growth in viewership, and we were able to see the benefit of going online and the benefit of being truly digital natives. And so, we do look forward to having this behind us and going back to the in-person events because I think there's a lot of benefit, especially with the globalization of competitive arenas. But during this period, we are also able to take tremendous advantage of the growth in online viewership and the growth in gaming overall.
Fantastic. What about you guys, Sean and Jasper?
Yeah, so I think right now you see quite a lot of significant changes in the market. Obviously, when the COVID-19 situation started out earlier in this year, a lot of the companies were trying to shift significantly from moving through a traditionally physical or offline business, trying to transition to an online platform as the months goes by, because a lot of the impact from the events getting cancelled by different governments trying to contain the situation. So there has been a lot of operational change for sure, especially on the publisher side, who are running long-term legs coming out of studios at this point in time. A lot of it has gone either fully online or actually with studios in limited capacity. So even in places like South Korea, where there's a physical arena for League of Legends in the market itself, the arena was actually fully closed to the public, and members of the staff were trying to make sure that only the key operational and staff and players were involved with the entire broadcast itself. So that actually significantly impacted how a lot of the production was being carried out. You also see a larger shift in spending from the sponsors itself. Obviously, I think when the COVID situation hit, a lot of sponsors were already cancelling or trying to navigate their sponsorships around traditional sports. But discovering a new opportunity that surfaced during this COVID period was definitely exploring a digital transition, especially if the sports has I would say, a similar predecessor in the traditional sports space. So things like the F1 went entirely digital, and you see the entire esports F1 being broadcasted on TV in the Western markets. And then you obviously also see a lot more changes in the other form of sports as well. Things like La Liga for football went entirely digital, with the players playing FIFA entirely. So you see two major changes being that sponsors are looking for esports that has went digital successfully, and then also explore the existing esports market space as something they will potentially consider in the near future. But from an operational point of view, almost everything that had a physical element got cancelled, and now I think a lot of it is either moved online, and hopefully in the coming years having a better chance of happening again in the near future. Yeah.
And what about for yourself, Sean?
Yeah, I mean, just echoing a lot what Jasper and John said. I think, macro-wise, obviously, the whole COVID situation's impacted, a lot of economies and a lot of different regions in different ways. And I think, one benefit we have had in the esports space is that, people spending more time at home, gaming has generally gone up, and I think viewerships online has definitely helped with the esports side of things. I think logistically for teams and it's just been an absolute nightmare trying to sort of navigate sort of different regions and a lot of the leagues that we play in, whether it be in Pacific or in Korea or in Taiwan or in Thailand, obviously, there are a lot of players that travel in between, and trying to get that all sorted has been an absolute nightmare. But I must say, most of the publishers that we've worked with, whether it be Garena, Riot, Blizzard, Ubisoft, have done a fantastic job, I think, transitioning everything from a physical offline background into a sort of more of an online tournament format. And I think that that's been beneficial. And obviously, with a lot of traditional sports being impacted, it's been beneficial from the esports perspective. I think certain tournament formats have been affected a lot from our perspective from more of the fighting game styles. I think games like Tekken 7 and Street Fighter 5, which are more of a sort of global WTP style, if I reference a traditional sport in tennis, where the players will travel around the world in different tournaments and collect points. At the end of the year, the top 20 players go to a grand final. Those ones I think have been impacted significantly simply because of the structure. Street Fighter, Tekken 7 are like mini tournaments around the world. You go collect points, and then once you've collected points, you basically go to a grand final. And that has been impacted significantly, we feel, because basically they've got nothing to do because there's nothing that's happening in that space. So I think some impact to certain titles, but I think overall, most of the titles have navigated it quite well. And for teams, it's actually been somewhat beneficial net compared to other industries. Yeah.
Interesting. So overall, when we look at the value of the esports market, we've seen a huge growth year on year. Obviously, in part driven by COVID and the practicalities of brands and advertisers needing to shift budgets from traditional sports that haven't happened. But we've seen it cross the $1 billion mark in revenue. So with this in mind, we've seen huge attention coming in from brands and advertisers. And Jasper, I would like you to touch on a little bit how non-endemic, in particular, how non-endemic brands have been coming into the space. Because I think, again, a lot of the people on this call may be assuming that when you look at the types of sponsors for esport, you would assume that it's the Logitechs or the Razers, people who make peripherals, mice, keyboards, the Intels and AMDs who have traditionally driven a lot of esport for obvious reasons. But now we're beginning to see a lot of mainstream brands coming in. And I think some of the work that Sport5 have been doing, in particular with BMW, is really inspiring. So could you touch on that a little bit for us?
Yeah, so I think especially in the last 2 to 3 years, there has been a significant shift in how brands have come into the market itself. Obviously, I think the earlier part in 2016, 2017, you see more people who wanted to get into the space as a stakeholder in terms of owning a team or league itself. That was particularly impacted with the celebrities coming into the space, owning a piece of pie of that. But with that kind of recognition and status growing from a digital sports property, then you see a lot of them also understanding that this is probably how the best way for a lot of the brands itself out there to engage a younger, more digital audience that traditionally the brands might have not interacted with probably in the last maybe 10 to 15 years of the way they do marketing and advertising as well. So with that particular change coming through in the last 2-3 years, definitely a lot of the brands are now looking at this piece of the pie, basically understanding I need to reach a younger audience, but I have not understand what predominantly has been part of their lifestyles and part of their consumer habits, especially when it comes to how they are behaving in this day and age, especially when you look at the younger folks nowadays. There's a lot more people who's watching videos on YouTube, watching streams on Twitch, and then there's a lot more people who's consuming all this content all entirely online. And a lot of the brands are trying to understand, other than serving out an ad that they can push through maybe the Facebook or Google ad through search, there's a lot of understanding that content becomes a very significant conversation changer with the consumers itself. And then because of that fact that they needed content, a lot of it is trying to understand it from the consumer habits. And then with that significant understanding that a lot of this consumer that they have engaged with have a very strong liking or very strong interest in esports as a very engaging part of their lifestyles. A lot of it has then now come into the space being like, for example, BMW, they are looking to be recognized as a brand that, for the future generation, you want to impact the consumers, not that they should buy a BMW car right now. Most of them might not have the spending power to do so. But being involved with the space, being recognized with the people who they are associated with, especially for BMW, what they did was they started a sponsorship campaign which was targeted towards the 5 best teams in League of Legends last year. And this was a very, very big focus to actually build the brand association with all of these esports teams as well. Because most of the teams that they have selected are basically the top teams in each individual region that they represent. There's an association with BMW coming out to a lot of consumers as saying, only the best works with the best as well. So BMW, with that kind of brand positioning and brand strategy, they then see that the relevance and the way they needed to do this was to get the sponsorship activated across all 5 teams. And with that perspective in mind, a lot of it is then focused on how the teams are actually assisting the brand to be positioned as such. So a lot of the activation, the social media strategy, look at the 5 teams interacting with each other as the potential contenders at the World Championship this year. And with that focus in mind, BMW, who is then now entirely new to the market, is being seen as, oh, I'm the cool brand now because I'm being associated with, the legends inside League of Legends itself. And this actually impacts how the entire brand strategy and the brand positioning shifts dynamically based on how the teams are being perceived because they are associated with BMW as well. So there's a understanding that coming into the space right now gives them an edge because they look at this space as something they never used to deal with. And now, because of how they choose to work with the selected rights holder, they activate based on the social media capabilities as well as the digital content that these teams are pushing out to engage the fans. Because a lot of these teams are actually producing very organic, very engaging content that fans are always willing to look at in terms of the videos that they produce. So in terms of some of the, I wouldn't say numbers, but in terms of some of the viewership expectations, a lot of this content within the first hours of it being released is viewed by close to 100,000 people easily. So to BMW, this is the best way to engage a very effective manner and also a very loyal audience who's very loyal to the teams themselves. Yeah.
Great, thank you. So, I mean, from my observations as well, I've been surprised about some of the brands that are coming in. So, in particular, MasterCard has made some really big plays. They're obviously the kind of payment partner for League of Legends global tournaments. I think that's really exciting as well because it's very clear that a brand like that is not just operating at the values level, but they're also identifying that that is the point of market entry for so many of the audience for esports. And so the obvious players like Gillette are moving in as well. You've got Unilever brands moving in a really big way. Some at the team level, some at the kind of league and the tournament level. Specifically, you touched upon content, and I think that's a really, really interesting space. I would like Sean, could you just dig into a little bit on the economics of teams? So this is a topic that isn't often touched upon when people are talking on panels. Normally it's all hyperbolic and saying, oh, it's the biggest thing out there, everybody should be buying into esport. But in particular, Talon, from my understanding, has really doubled down in the space and invested very heavily ahead of the curve in terms of your own creative capabilities. So could you just touch upon that a little bit, and also touch upon how you've diversified your income streams outside of kind of prize winnings in the traditional forms?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I think a lot of investors, when we first talk to them, they kind of see esports as the kind of traditional sports, right? You just have winnings and that's kind of it. And teams are reliant on that. And I think that is probably a pretty large misconception. And a lot of large esports teams globally, even Team Secret, the TLs, your G2s, your Fanatics, all these guys have multiple revenue streams, which are really, really important. And so from our perspective, when we looked at it as well, we thought, hey, winnings can be choppy, right? Even if you have the best performance framework, the best scouts, the best players, sometimes, you need a bit of luck. Things need to go the right way, and you can have good years and bad years, right? And relying on that as a method to consistently grow revenues is something that we felt that was not going to be sustainable and not something that we wanted to have, because you just have really choppy revenues every single year, which is not what you want to build as a business. And so what we decided to do is have a look at what are the other parts of the ecosystem within esports that we could potentially capture. And one of them is definitely the creative studio side of things. And what we realized that, if you look at Team Liquid, for example, they've done a fantastic job with One Up Studios. We thought, well, there's definitely a need for that here in Asia. And particularly, let's say here in Hong Kong, one of our home markets, a lot of brands have come to us and said, hey, we've touched or reached out to traditional marketing agencies and asked, how do we reach into esports? How do we develop content? How do we develop the brand awareness within this space that's not cringy or fake, or is not like, basically when gamers look at it, they just laugh at it. And so we started with the notion of creating a creative studio, and this creative studio kind of covers multiple things. So we do everything from video production, graphics, directors, 3D animations. We can do all of that. We're trying to look more and more into events, as well as also consultancy within the esports space. So a lot of brands have come to us. And so it serves as two purposes. Number one, it helps our own team generate high quality content, which is important for partners anyway. And secondly, we also do work on behalf of partners which aren't exactly tied to Talon Esports. And so some of the names that we're working with here in Hong Kong aren't exactly sponsors of Talon, but we're helping them leverage our KOLs or our network of KOLs that we know within Hong Kong or Taiwan to help them create campaigns which are interesting and really help push their brands further out. From additional revenue sources, another thing which we've felt that has been really important is the merch. I think streetwear is a massive thing here in Asia, and partnering with PSG as well is something that we've done is also an important aspect. I can mention here that we are working with PSG on some exciting collaborations when it comes to clothing, which I think is going to be super unique and awesome. And that's another area that we feel that we can really capture a lot of. If you look at what Clan FaZe has done in the US, they're not exactly the most successful esports team, but they're the most followed esports team in the way that they've been able to capture pop culture, fashion, and incorporate those aspects. And so from that perspective, we feel like we want to leverage upon that and develop that further. And so, we're always looking at new ways. The Academy is also a diversified revenue stream, because we've consistently been able to develop players within Overwatch or League of Legends and being able to move them on to larger leagues. Particularly the Overwatch League, we've had a lot of interest from our squad regularly year on year, with top teams coming over and inquiring about players and coaches. And so we feel like, if we are able to create a systematic approach when it comes to developing talent, that is also an interesting business model that we feel saves us money, because we can filter good talent through our teams, but also, if they have ambitions to play in different regions, that we can also assist them with that and also benefit from that as well. Yeah.
And John, I've got to say that I really love the Team Secret kind of monochromatic style of your merch. It's pretty awesome. And I just saw the recent collaboration with Champion. So could you walk us through, again, kind of how you've diversified your income streams, and specifically touch upon merch and the role that has as well?
Yeah, sure, absolutely. I think Sean covered a bunch of good points that I'll echo on and add to, hopefully. I think it's a big misnomer to say, like, esports teams are very dependent on prize pool earnings, because I think that one, it's not sustainable over time, right? You can be, again, like the best esports team in the world, but to do it consistently over time, hopefully you can do it, but some years you'll have bad years, as with all competitive sports. And the lion's share of most of the prize pools goes to directly to the players anyway. So from an organizational, from a club perspective, right, you really need to be sustainable in other ways and diversify your revenue streams in order to be a thriving business. And you can do that in a number of ways, right? I think it's important to have a brand identity and to have a plan, you know, and not just diversify for the sake of diversification, right? Try to get into sort of everything. I think, you know, kind of like what Sean said, right? You have like, you know, 3 different pillars, and then you say, okay, these are the pillars that I want to focus on, right? I think for Team Secret, ourselves, we want to focus on licensing our brand and building our brand as big as possible, and monetization through, you know, the licensing, media rights, through merchandise, and even through merchandise, right? Having an identity, whether it's a visual identity or it's a lifestyle type of identity, to really go after the collaborations and the types of partnerships that you want to join with in order to further that brand, right? And so, you know, we've done stuff with Champion. We feel that it's the right brand in terms of demonstrating that we are all about performance, right? We want to be cool, you know, on the way to having higher performing teams. But from a brand perspective, right, it really fits with our visual identity. You know, we've done stuff with like Tumi, for example, right? There are a lot of luxury brands that are also getting into esports simply because the viewership, as you mentioned, some of the demographics are very favorable to those luxury brands. And I think the income levels of some of the viewership in some markets is actually higher than traditional sports, right? So there's tremendous spending power to be unlocked. But interestingly enough, in those markets, right, the income levels are higher, but the spending is not higher, has not caught up to the spending of traditional sports fans. So therein lies the potential, and therein is why a lot of luxury brands are getting in, and why we want to work with a lot of them. I think from a diversification of revenue perspective and building a sustainable business, it's important not only to have a identity and a strategy, but also to do things in a stepwise and measured fashion. So for example, merchandise, right? I get a lot of questions around from relatively new esports clubs that come and say, hey, you know, how do you do merchandise? How do you, you know, go and sell, you know, 1 million t-shirts, that kind of thing. But it's important to remember that, you know, if you're just starting out as a newer esports brand and you have, let's say, like 1,000 fans, right? Now is probably not the time for you to be focused on merchandise. It's, you know, you spend your resources and your time better in building your brand out, so that when you actually go to market and actually focus on merchandise, there's actually an audience that can consume what you're trying to sell. If you just start off, you know, right away in some of these activities, you might, you know, have failures off the ground and not even get off the ground with some of these initiatives. So having that more measured pace and doing things at the right time, I think timing is very important to rolling out your strategy.
And actually building on that, coming in from an investor perspective, you've obviously been on the receiving end, Sean and John, with a lot of inquiries with regards to potential outside investment. Can you talk us through, are there any key themes that are coming up, and what are the investors really looking for in terms of the way that they're valuing your companies? Or have you got your own frameworks by which you drive that agenda with the investors? So maybe start with you, Sean.
Yeah, I think one of the key things that we've always pushed at Talon here around some of the key distinguishing factors of our team versus other teams is firstly, you know, our objective, and it may sound crazy, is to build the first true Pan-Asian esports team and to have a presence from Japan all the way down to Australia. And we've already kind of gone through that, bootstrapping the business ourselves. So we're in Korea, we're in Taiwan, we're in Hong Kong, we're in Thailand. And obviously due to the COVID this year, there's bit hard to expand into any more markets, but you know, the end objective is to build that. And I think one of the other things that was sort of we really pushed was to make sure that the games that we enter into specific markets are very relevant for those regions. And what's difficult about APAC is that you have a lot of large fragmentation, which is difficult when it comes to expanding, right? Because if I look at an example, Hong Kong, you know, big fans of League of Legends, but you know, could we do a League of Legends team in Thailand? Probably most likely not. And so, you know, in Thailand, similar as you mentioned before, mobile is one of the biggest things because everyone has a mobile phone. Not everyone can get a high-end PC yet. And, you know, the mobile connections, whether it be 3G, 4G, 5G is fantastic. And so that's another thing that's been really important. Having to diversify and finding games that are relevant in those markets so that you can get faster ROIs when it comes to eyeballs, when it comes to fans, when it comes to sponsorship opportunities. Because trying to force particular games into markets where the audience is not there, then it's just very hard to kind of build that fan base. So trying to build that true Pan-Asian thing. I think also from investors, what they also like is having diversified revenue streams. As you mentioned before, that's a really important topic. Looking at different aspects of the business, whether it be on content, whether it be on sort of the team side, whether it be on the academy. These are all important aspects to ensure that you can have steady growth over time. Some of the investors are really looking at franchise leagues as well. I think that's an important aspect in esports that's slowly happening within APAC, and definitely League of Legends has led that through the US and Europe and China and recently Korea, and obviously being able to push more of that is important. One of the leagues that we operate in Thailand is actually franchised, and that's also beneficial for investors because essentially you become part owners of that league and sharing the benefits of, as the media rights grows, as the sponsorships grows, as the audience grows, the teams benefit directly as well as the league, and there's a kind of combined sort of alignment of interest between the teams and the leagues as well. So that's been kind of, I guess, the main inquiries, and I guess also just just having a good solid plan and business plan and strategy and management behind the teams is really important. I think what you have in esports when it comes to investing, particularly on the team side, you have like a lot of businessmen who are trying to be gamers and gamers who are trying to be businessmen, and it's kind of a weird mix sometimes. But I think having people and similar to guys like John and Jasper here who have come from sort of mixed backgrounds in gamers, worked in other industries, being able to bring that level of professionalism to team management and be able to plan and develop teams over time and having a clear strategy. I think that's also been a big sort of plus from our perspective when people are looking at our team. Yeah.
Thank you. And for you, John?
Yeah, I mean, I completely agree. I think that a lot of the tenets of traditional business when it comes to investments continue to apply in esports. So obviously, sustainability is great. Having more stability of franchise leagues is also great versus non-franchise leagues. But I think beyond that, one of the things that we really look at is matching up investor profiles, essentially what the investor wants exposure to the type of investment in esports that strongly aligns to that profile, right? And so there's a number of different ways to be successful as a team brand. And this goes back to my previous point on the brand's identity, right? So you can be a esports brand that doesn't do that well in tournaments, but is highly, highly watched, right? Very good content creators, influencers, that type of lifestyle brand. You can have different regional focuses, right? You can be focused in Europe, in North America, in Asia, right? As Sean mentioned, a Pan-Asian company that is Talon. Or you can be, filtered in different regions. And you can even filter on different types of game genres, right? We focus only on, racing games, racing simulator games versus, fighting games versus strategy games. And I think all these types of filters lead to, what do you stand for? What do you represent as an esports brand and as an esports team club? And how does that match up with then the investor profile? And I think once you find those alignments, then you can find investors that are really bought into your vision and bought into your vision beyond just the basic tenets of having a sustainable business, having good growth rates, having a good fan base, having all those things that you need to have in a growing business to be able to attract investors. But strategically and long term, like these are the things that what will attract investors into your brand itself, how you envision your brand playing out over time.
Really nice. So actually that leads really well into a conversation that I'm going to initiate with Jasper. So Jasper, when we look at the way that investors move into environments such as operating in esports teams, obviously it can't just be at the team level. It can't just be at the publisher level, i.e. the people who own the IP around the game and operate the league. But it also has to have the comfort and support, I think, of the governmental infrastructure, or at least industry bodies that work around these things and ensure things like, safe value delivery on the part of brands. Singapore, looking at it, has been really instrumental in a couple of these areas. And in fact, there's a global esport federation based out of Singapore that's trying to lead this charge for the world. Could you just touch on that a little bit, Jasper, bearing in mind the kind of industry knowledge that you have from that perspective?
Yeah, so I think the only thing I have to sort of say as a disclaimer is I don't work for the associations or the federations, but because I work on the government side of things, I think the insight to what they're actually doing is, as you see a industry that is so nascent and so young, growing very fast over the last, to be very specific, I think 15, 20 years of how esports has changed from something like starting out from convention halls, going to stadium nows, and them being such an influential industry, especially towards the younger generation. There is an understanding that all this growth needs to be managed at a reasonable level, and there's a lot of people's expectations of how this industry's evolution towards the different ages that they went through, probably regulated, and to make sure not a lot of people get into trouble while coming into this space. And what we mean by trouble here is because as a young industry, obviously it went through its own fair shares of trials and tribulations, and a lot of it is getting people properly set up with the right um, guidelines and the right infrastructure out there. So a lot of what these organizations are playing a role is trying to be two things, especially in this day and age. One is representing the players, which are a very underrepresented group in the space itself. Obviously, there's teams who are traditionally companies in nature, and then there's the scenario where there are leagues, both operated by publishers and event organizers itself. So when all these people are trying to get themselves a professional career out there, you don't want someone close to you getting cheated out of their salaries, or getting cheated because they don't have the understanding of how the real corporate world works out there. So they fundamentally unionize or represent the players in terms of their actual position within the industry itself. Secondly, they try to be more of a I'll say regulating body, and sometimes authority if there's a collaboration with the government directly. But in that two particular role, it then provides what esports as a young industry potentially need to consider right now, because it is a very nascent industry. Most of it is regulated by what the private sector is growing in terms of revenues and how contracts are being set up, because they are traditionally built around traditional company structures. So with all these organizations in mind, then they play a very infrastructure role to the industry itself. And because of how these things are being placed, then their role is to be sort of a middleman between the government and the industry itself. But I think fundamentally trying to get a understanding in between those spaces also something this government uh, organizers no sorry the government bodies and the industry bodies have to navigate very carefully, because I think right now, because of what the private sector represents, a lot of it is no longer nationalistic in nature. So not all forms of esports have an idea that they should be representing a country, going out for competitions, and then fundamentally become national athletes in terms of the aspirations that they are growing towards. So they play a very unique position. But I think right now for them, they are still trying to find out where that actual direction they are taking is actually more or less suitable for the industry itself. Fundamentally, I think a lot of the people in the private sector is also trying to understand what all this organization mean. Do they represent the government, or are they more of a middleman who can represent both sides, or actually interact with both sides as well? So I think for them, then understanding what it means right now is also to see how they benefit the industry as a whole. If they don't really do anything that benefits the industry, I think the industry naturally might reject them in the process. But it's more or less things that they have to be very transparent and very clear about. From the government point of view, it's more of us trying to understand that there is a industry and market growing out there. It is dealing directly with the younger generation, and we are not stepping in to regulate or authorize any movements or directions within the space itself. We want this industry to grow, but we also must deal with it with the right resources and understand that because this industry fundamentally represents multiple verticals. So a lot of times people misunderstand, oh, esports is equals to gaming. So doing something for video game means something for esports will naturally grow. But we look at it from a multi-faceted point of view. There's things that we consider from production, video production, business and marketing, hospitality. So there's a lot of industries in the space right now. There's a lot of industry in the space right now, all doing things that is relevant to esports. And how do we make sure all these different parts of the industry can be represented as career opportunities for a younger generation, as well as an industry that can grow and then be self-sustainable on its own. Growing a very, very big part of where, in terms of where the Singapore government wants to come to play, these are the things that we want to do. But to understand that all of it must also work with the growth of the industry itself is then the direction of where all these collaborations might take place. But the government is always open to conversations with the industry, largely not just from the association itself, but we do engage with the companies directly on what they need as things that they will be able to grow together and become a more influential part of the industry. So, yeah.
Thanks. And I'm opening it up to John and Sean as well. Guys, what do we think are some of the prevalent themes emerging, or the big kind of topics around esport? Are there trends that are evolving that we can be looking at 2021 and applying it for next year, or are we busy focused on the present right now?
I guess I'll go first. I don't think this is for 2021, and I'll pose a question. I think this is a big question in esports, potentially a billion-dollar question, and I don't have the answers to, but I know that us on the panel, as well as potentially our viewers, will have a hand in shaping this. But it's the question around monetization of media rights and IP. And it's potentially a billion-dollar question and much later down the road, because as esports matures, I think the question around, okay, who owns what and who gets the rights to monetize what is going to be a major focus. Because when you think about it, right, we go and play these games and we play competitions, but ultimately it's the publisher developer that owns the IP of the game itself, right? And then you have tournament organizers and you have studios and you have leagues that create the product around esports, right, based off of the game IP. And then you have the teams and the talent that are actually the stars of that content and actually build a lot of that content ourselves, right? So then, out of all these stakeholders, right, who has the rights to monetize, and then, kind of in what proportion, and how do you work that? I think that's a big question that will come up, as esports starts to mature and as the industry starts to move in that fashion.
Sean, you look poised to tell us something.
Oh, yeah. From my perspective, I think mobile gaming in Southeast Asia is going to be something that's going to continue to trend in a really positive direction, we feel. With the emergence of sort of cheap handsets, as well as better technologies, whether it be the 3G, 4G, 5G, I think that's going to be a big focus for us around Southeast Asia. I'll be interested to see how the publishers sort of play that out. There's obviously a whole bunch of different publishers in Southeast Asia, whether it be Riot, Garena, or Moontoon, that have various different titles around there. But I think that's going to be a big trend, simply because of the fact that everyone has a mobile, and the Southeast Asian market is huge, right? And I think that's really an interesting space that's going to be very prevalent. Markets like Indonesia, like Vietnam, like the Philippines and Thailand, mobile gaming, the populations alone are going to be something that I think is very powerful and very interesting to look at as we go into the future. I think franchising is also a big thing that is going to be important for teams as well. And, John just mentioned around sort of media rights, right? There was a beautiful graph I think Goldman put out in one of the equity research reports that showed like the viewership of esports compared to traditional sports and where the revenues were. And the biggest differential usually is in that media rights space. And I think franchising, as that slowly comes through for various publishers and they realize the value of that, and it's already starting to happen or already happened in certain leagues, that the teams can start to benefit more and more from particular media rights that I sold. Definitely, the franchise league that we operate in Thailand, they do sell media rights on behalf of a particular web platform. That platform pays for X amount every single year, and that gets distributed down to the team. So there is some benefit of that, seeing more. So, for us, we want to see like the franchising of leagues, I think is a good thing. Creates a lot of safety when it comes to investment. The teams do spend a lot of money in developing the talent, the stories, the brand. The reason why the fans come back is they want to see rivalry, right? And so I think and we're really starting to see that as more and more publishers are starting to support teams more and more through different methods. And I think franchising is definitely one that I think is very powerful as well. So those are probably the two that I think are very interesting next year.
Interesting. That seems to be a common theme whenever you talk to team owners. They're like, where's the money coming from the publisher? Media rights are one part of that. Yeah. Great, guys. So we actually have a few questions. And I wanted to spend a bit of time on that because we've only got 10 minutes left on the call. I'd like to open, Sean, you're apparently going to answer the question about Messi joining PSG. Do you want to touch on that?
Of course. Oh, I think it'd be an amazing signing. I think if you look at that forward line that PSG has, adding Messi to that would be amazing. And they're probably one of the only two clubs that probably can afford him right now, right? PSG or City. But yeah, I think it'd be cool if he joined, and having the best player in the world on any team, I think it's not a bad thing.
All right. I've got a feeling you might get into trouble for that answer. What about the expansion into the Middle East is one of the questions that came up from one of the audience, both of you. Sean and John?
Yeah, I mean, I'll get started on that. I just also want to say I don't represent PSG when it comes to Messi signings. Obviously, the CEO decides that. I'm just saying as an esports fan, just in case anyone thinks that I actually represent. For the Middle East, for sure. I mean, it's something we want to look at, but our main focus over the next couple of years is to really build out an APAC presence, and that's, like as I mentioned before, having a presence from Japan all the way down to Australia. And so we still have a lot of work to do. We are in most of those markets now, but we are looking to expand. There are huge opportunities, I feel, in the Middle East, and it will just come down to timing and opportunity. But for us, I would say the main focus is APAC, and that's Japan all the way down to Australia, and to build teams and presences across all those different markets. Yeah.
Yeah, I think it's similar for us. I think I view Middle East as a tremendous opportunity. I think there's from a governmental standpoint to a community standpoint to various stakeholders in the market. I think there's a lot of activity and investment in esports. I think even at the governmental level, there's tons of money pouring into even charity events and throwing major competitions and building arenas and things like that. So I think Middle East will be a tremendous growth center for esports overall. It's not a huge focus for us. We focus more on the core European countries, and then we also focus on Southeast Asia. And so that's where our focus will be within the next at least 2 years. But I think Middle East as a region and as a part of the esports ecosystem worldwide overall will be a tremendous investment opportunity going forward.
There's a bit of a spicy question around whether it's realistic to think of esport teams as profitable organizations. Who would like to answer that?
Yeah, I think it is. I think it's I wouldn't invest in esports for like an immediate ROI based on profitability. It's not sort of an industry where you start a company, you sell widgets, and then it's like, when do you break even and how many more widgets can you sell, right? I think it's an industry where you really need to try to build a brand and then figure out where in what areas you want to diversify your business, and then kind of go from there. So the business profile of each esports team will be different depending on those various factors. But I think it is reasonable to expect esports companies to break even or at least be profitable within a reasonable amount of time, just because I think there's tremendous opportunities and tremendous ways that we can break from the sort of constraints of traditional sports, right? We don't need to have heavy infrastructure costs, for instance, right? In traditional sports, you need to have an arena, you need to have like, training facilities, you need to have all these things. Whereas, we can operate, digitally a lot of times, right? And reduce like the carrying costs of maintaining all that infrastructure. And there's other ways that, we can monetize and be, very efficient in operating. So I do think that, depending on, it really depends on the individual company and how things are run and the philosophy of the management that's in place. But I think there is, you can find esports teams that are, profitable.
Just to echo that, I think completely agree with what John mentioned. I think the key thing is for people to realize that this is still a very nascent and young industry, and I think the revenues and the profitability options will come over time. I think at this stage where things are still growing, things are being formalized, your leagues are still being developed and structured and put in the right place, sponsors are coming in, media rights are coming in, that in the short term, I don't think that most teams, from my understanding, are like hugely profitable. The main focus is of course is to break even if possible, and then obviously squeeze out a profit if you can. I do agree with John. Like definitely the capex cost to set up an esports team nowhere near as high as traditional sports, and also having a digital nature definitely opens up a lot of different monetization options that you can look at. I think a lot of esports teams have a lot of fans, and right now, if you just thinking off the top of my head, creating monetization options with your fans is an interesting way that I guess most teams haven't even looked at. I think Team Liquid recently launched some sort of platform where it's a lot of content or certain features are behind paywalls for their fans, and those are powerful tools if you think about how many fans they have globally. So I think there's still a lot of opportunities to come. There's still a lot of ways to make money within esports yet to be formalized, and I think the key thing is that the growth is phenomenal when it comes to viewership. It's there. It's not fake. It's happening. Gaming is becoming a major entertainment platform, if not already the biggest entertainment platform, and so we foresee that over time that these things will definitely but I would say in the most immediate, I would say that statement is probably somewhat relevant and true.
I think we've got time for a couple more, depending on how we handle them. So first of all, one from Nathan. How did you get started in creating an esport team in terms of financing? I.e., did you need to find investors, etc., and talent acquisition? Sean, you've just spoken. Could you touch on that a little bit?
Yeah, I mean, our story is a bit silly and stupid, but basically, we're reading equity research report about esports, and we thought, hey, this would be kind of cool. We actually just met someone playing Overwatch online in Taiwan, and when our first team, we just bootstrapped ourselves. It wasn't expensive at all. We talked to this person over a period of time, became a good friend of ours, and then he knew some of the esports people or players, Overwatch players within Taiwan. We flew over there, put together a scrappy deck on the plane as we landed there, pitched it to the guys, and that's how we started with our first team. We made a lot of mistakes, a lot of things screwed up during that time, but that's how we started. I think over time we formalized and changed that process. I think now, obviously we've brought in outside investment as we've ramped up into bigger titles such as League of Legends, and obviously require a lot more investment. And then we've also built out a performance framework, leveraging a lot from traditional sport, and also with Paris, learning from them about how they manage clubs. So we do have like a full scouting system across the region for League of Legends, and have a performance framework around how we identify, build, and develop and retain talent. But when we first started, I'll be completely honest, it was just we just tried, right? We just spoke to a bunch of guys. We thought they were good. We hired a coach. We let it go, and then we learned from our mistakes over time, and basically started learning more from traditional sport and realizing, hey, a lot of the processes that they have there are actually relevant. Not so much on the physical training side, but generally how you manage a squad and an organization from the performance side on a year-to-year basis. And so that's how it all started, to be honest. It was bootstrapped by us, and we just flew to Taiwan, met a random team, sponsored them, and learned that way. Yeah.
Yeah, similar story on our end. When we first started out, we just kind of bootstrapped it. It's like a couple of years ago. I had the honor and the luck of meeting some of the talent in the Dota scene. And we came together and we said, look, there's we have a great brand, but there's no business around it, and so let's build a business together. And we built Team Secret together, starting from Dota and then expanding into other titles, and then eventually we got some outside investment to be able to take the next step into growth. Yeah, I think overall it's a very similar journey. Yeah, when I look into talent acquisition and into expanding into new teams, I kind of look at it as investing into startups, meaning looking at the talent and the management and the leadership qualities of the teams that we want to get into, right? So when we get into new teams, we're like, hey, is there management and is there a captain in place that will actually take this team to the levels that we want it to be, right? And I think those leadership qualities are very important in setting up the identity of the team itself in each of the various markets that we want to play in, and also kind of lead the team to success in a number of ways, not just competitively, but how do you represent yourself in media, how do you represent the brand, and how do you grow yourself in the market and with the fan base. So we invest a lot into how we look at people.
Okay, guys, there is a really good question around your opinions of the publisher's role in esport, whether they're too involved or influential, or if this is in fact the path forward. I think it would be a bit unfair to get into that without publisher representation on the panel. So I'd like to ask another question. Jasper, if you could please address this. You can always trust Julian Jackson to ask you really difficult questions. So do you think that the developers will get onto the media rights revenue bandwagon and start to charge for their content as in international sports?
Well, I'm going to start saying hi, Julian. It's Jasper. He's a close friend of mine anyway. To really touch on this topic, I think for a long time it has sort of been neglected because largely I think the people buying the content might have been unsure what market value actually was and then how much it's actually worth as well. But to really touch on this topic, I think this space is growing quite significantly. Obviously, with I think more what I would consider an industry milestone was that the World Championship media rights for China for the League of Legends World Championship as well this year was sold for an estimated 100 million to Bilibili, which is one of China's largest streaming platforms. So there's an understanding from a very involved publisher's perspective. You definitely see the monetization opportunity coming from esports because someone is willing to pay for it in that space and time. However, that discussion might not be naturally centered towards anything exclusive unless it is very, very high in value. So things like the international, I think one of the biggest point of contention right now is to look at how the properties around Dota 2 are usually shaped and shifted in terms of the way those properties are structured. Because when you look at especially in Dota 2, most of the tournaments are usually one-off or happening on a annual basis, but not happening regularly enough. So a lot of times the people who's buying all this content will be asking, am I buying into just 2 weeks worth of content, which is how long a typical tournament duration might be like, versus something like for right now League of Legends is broadcasted over 13 leagues over 10 weeks per season, giving them a substantial amount of content where they can sell this to advertisers saying, hey, if you want to show your ad 10 times in the span of 10 weeks, you get this amount of content that's already on the platform itself. So naturally, I think a lot of the conversation with publishers right now is how do they organize a lot of their esports strategies around how they present esports around the game itself. Is it something that is going to be for a long time naturally one-off because of the way the teams are qualifying to the leagues itself, or because they are qualifying to the tournaments itself? Because right now, I think that conversation exists very differently across all different publishers. but there are publishers who are already recognizing this opportunity. So a lot of them are diversifying, previous, known resources into one-off tournaments that are transitioning into proper professional leagues right now, going to a structured weekly broadcast, going to a structured format that can be consumed on either TV or digital platforms. So there is always the space and understanding. Previously, where I came from, in a company like ESL, I always used to share with a lot of clients who used to ask me, why is the media rights not big yet or not valuable enough yet? And I say a large part of it is because the over reliance on sponsorship traditionally reduced the need for the media rights values to be growing very significantly. But we always used to say the ratio of how much sponsorship makes for an event is about 80-20. And now I think in the future, especially with what we see with League of Legends, there is a potential scenario where media rights might cover that 80% ratio and then sponsorship that 20% as well. So in the current time and space, maybe in the case of Valve as a publisher, because of how the Dota circuit is designed and organized, the potential opportunities related to it really needs Valve's significant investment to grow themselves beyond what it naturally represents. While outside of the League of Legends circuit, you do see a lot of the other games in the market itself, especially for esports, growing and maturing into proper sports-like properties, so that they can gain better acceptance into being sold on the commercial market. Because right now, media rights, to be really honest, it's very hard to sell a 2 weeks event, imagining that any of the TV stations or digital platforms can find enough advertisers who just want to commit to 2 weeks and then spend, $50,000 to $100,000 because there's only that opportunity in the whole year to do so. So I think that's the balancing act where publishers get involved with commercializing their properties, but also designing them ready for traditional market formats, because all these people who are interested need to find a reason to buy into something that is more sustainable and long-term, and not because this week there's a tournament broadcast, so it should be sold for $1 million. But in the real world, that doesn't make sense for any businessman to look at a conversation and say, I need to put in 7-digit figures to buy into only 2 weeks worth of content. I think that's some of the conversations on the media right where it needs to grow. But the industry and the structure that the industry has been very, very used to also needs to grow as well. Yeah.
Right. Thank you very much, Jasper, for that insight. So thank you, audience, for joining us. Hope you had great new information to bring back with you. I'd like to thank the panelists for today, Sean, Jasper, John, and especially Jamie as well, to do this for us. So in partnership with Mana Partners to organize this webinar. Thank you very much. I know there are a couple of questions more, so feel free to reach out to the panelists on LinkedIn as well, or you can reach out to me to have your questions addressed to them. So fill up the survey before you after you exit from this webinar. I'd like to thank once again. Stay safe, everyone. Stay well. So I'll see you next week for another webinar on the future of transportation, where we'll be talking about urban air mobility. So join us next week. Thank you. Thanks, everyone. Thank you very much. Have a good evening.
Thank you, everyone.
Bye.